Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the first Archaeology Hour of the year. And this is our free lecture series open to the public, where we can all spend 1 hour learning from experts in the field of archaeology and ancient history. Now, I'm Jacob Dahm. I'm an officer of the local Worcester, Massachusetts regional AIA chapter and a member of the Classics Department at the College of the Holy Cross. And I'm deeply excited to be introducing our program and our speaker today. Now, before I dive into all of that, I'd like to introduce our organization to those joining us for the first time today. The AIA is the oldest and largest archaeological organization in North America, but more importantly, it is an organization deeply connected with all levels of those interested in ancient studies. From the most senior academic researcher to a first grade classroom learning about the ancient world for the first time, the AIA has programs and efforts linked to a whole range of those interested in the past. Now, our organization publishes the popular archaeology magazine, but also the world's leading academic journal of Mediterranean archaeology, the American Journal of Archaeology, both of which are available to AIA members. In addition, the AIA facilitates access to a number of different ways for individuals to pursue an interest in the past. This includes traveling far afield, possibly by some of the fieldwork opportunities listed on our webpage, as well as a number of tour opportunities to go around the world with experts, and even elements that are much closer to home, uh, organized by the AIA, its local chapters, or other collaborating organizations. So, if you are at all interested in membership or our events, please do scan the QR code visible on the screen here or visit our website, archaeological.org. Membership to the AIA offers a number of benefits, including discounts on AIA programs like tours or the annual meeting, but also access to unique AIA resources in the form of publications, fellowships, and grants. As a nonprofit organization, we do rely on donations of all levels to support our mission. These donations support a wide variety of efforts centered on studying and preserving cultural heritage, as well as programming like this. And if you're at all interested in supporting the AIA, please use either the QR code located on the screen or visit our website at archaeological.org/donate, also visible here. So before we launch into the part everyone's here for, I want to take a moment and show off our program of speakers. Um, as you can see, we have a number of scholars coming in for our archaeology hour over the course of 2025, 2026, all of whom will be speaking on absolutely fascinating and ranging aspects of the past. I'd also like to make special mention of our next talk. Again, these are effectively monthly, to be delivered by Justin Leidwanger of Stanford University, titled Shipping Stone for Justinian's Empire. Okay, so now I can take some time to introduce our speaker, Tate Paulette, who's an associate professor in the Department of History at North Carolina State University, where his research and teaching focus on the food systems as well as the societies of some of the earliest polities and cities of the ancient Near East. He has conducted fieldwork all over the world, but currently is co-director of the excavations, and I'm going to do my best on this one, Makunta Vulesh Mercenudia in Western Cyprus. And I'll go ahead and say now, in introducing Tate, when faced with a CV like this, it becomes more than a little difficult to select from his many publications. But I do want to put some emphasis on his most recent book, In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia, published with Oxford University Press in 2024. But also, I want to mark my excitement for a forthcoming volume of which he's the editor, titled Cultural History of Wine and Antiquity. His articles cover a broad range of topics, everything from zoo archaeology to alcohol studies to more traditional archaeological analyses. Though the number one that I do want to miss is possibly one of my favorites, an article titled Inebriation and the Early State, Beer and the Politics of Affect in Mesopotamia, one that I've actually used in the classroom many times. I would also like to point out all of his work in a public capacity, bringing experimental archaeology to the broader public through experimental recreations of ancient beers and appearing on such wonderful programs as the Peopling the Past podcast. Needless to say, I am deeply excited to introduce our speaker, who will be delivering his lecture, Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. Before turning it over to Tate, I have two last announcements, so bear with me, with respect to our presentation. The first is a friendly reminder to our guests to respect the intellectual property of our presenter and not record this talk, as this is prohibited. The talk is being recorded by the AIA and will be shared publicly at a later date. In addition, we have some settings tips for Zoom users to assist you. Notably, on the screen, you'll see instructions for how to mute chat pop-ups throughout the talk, whether you're joining us on a mobile platform or computer. If you have questions as well, please type them into our dedicated Q&A box, not the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the lecture. I'll be reviewing these in the hopes of presenting them to Tate to answer. Okay, so with all of that aside, I am very happy again to introduce our talk. So please, Tate.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope the screen sharing is working all right. It's really great to be here with you this evening. Thanks to the AIA for inviting me, and to the Worcester Society for hosting. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining in. I'm going to use the time that I have this evening to introduce you to my new book, In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. So first, just a quick intro to the book, what sort of thing it is, the audience that it's aiming at, guiding principles, that sort of thing. Then I want to move through 5 moments from the book, using these to dig down into the kinds of the kinds of questions I address, the kinds of evidence available, and really just give you a sense of what the book is like. And then I should have some time for questions at the end. Okay. All right. So I called this book An Introduction to the World's First Great Beer Culture. So what do I mean by that? We are these days, if you're interested in ancient alcohol, this is a really great time. There's all kinds of interesting work being done. There's been a lot in particular using organic residue analysis. So, residues preserved on the inside of ceramic vessels, stone vessels, etc., to look at earlier and earlier evidence for alcohol in different parts of the world. And so we're getting all kinds of interesting information about the very earliest days of alcoholic beverages. In many cases, we don't, in those examples, we get little bits of info. These particular vessels held a beverage that included the following ingredients or something like that. But we can't really paint a full picture of what alcohol was doing in that particular society. So when I talk about Mesopotamia as the world's first great beer culture, what I mean is this is the first time where we have a really broad range of different kinds of evidence that allow us to really talk about this beer culture in its full complexity. And I should say I do spend a little bit of time in the book on that earlier evidence, but the real focus of the book starts in the vicinity of 3000 BC, a little bit before that. What is this book? I've given a lot of different talks over the years about beer in Mesopotamia to all different kinds of audiences, whether academic audiences, college students, brewers, or just general audiences of all different kinds. And my overriding impression that is across all of those different audiences, people are not just interested in hearing our conclusions. You might think that once you move beyond a strictly academic audience, people just kind of want to hear the conclusions of our research. I don't think that's right. I think across the board, people ask very good questions that really want to dig down into the details, how we got to those conclusions. And so the kind of guiding principle behind this book is that I am going to write for that broad audience, but I'm not going to avoid difficult issues of evidence and interpretation. It's just that I'm going to do the work to pull people into those issues and guide them through it, trying to be very clear about exactly what we know about beer in ancient Mesopotamia, how we know it, but also try to be really upfront about what we don't know with absolute certainty. So I raise a lot of questions, and sometimes those questions are not answerable. But I also do think that, part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to show readers just how much we actually know about the world of ancient Mesopotamia, and in particular about beer in that world. So, you'll see quite a lot that's really sort of strikingly familiar that mirrors some things about our own kind of beer cultures, but then immediately other things that might seem odd, surprising, strange in various ways. And so I'm trying to juxtapose those two elements throughout. In terms of style, it is meant to be informal and lighthearted. I try to keep the narrative moving as quickly as I can and not get too bogged down in any particular issues. I use a lot of sort of semi-fictional vignettes, taking us back into the past, particular places of time, and to really dig down into the kind of evidence we're dealing with, but to also kind of make it feel more real. And I also do a lot of focusing in on some particular piece of evidence that we can dig down into. Okay, so with that said, just a second. All right, so this is just a table of contents, just in case you're interested. How is this book organized? It moves broadly from a general introduction to sort of beer in world history, and then an introduction to ancient Mesopotamia, the kind of sources we have available, that sort of thing, and some sort of overview framing about the role of beer in the society. And then we really dig down in first to the brewing of beer, starting out with brewing ingredients and the types of beer that they were brewing, then brewing technologies and techniques, then brewers and brewing spaces. So that's all about brewing. And then for the later part of the book, I move into drinking. So drinkers and drinking practices, and then the experience of beer drinking. And then the final part digs down into some of this experimental brewing work that I've done, but also that some others have done. Okay, so as I said, that's my general intro. From now on, what I want to do is I want to take us through five sort of moments from the book. And these are those moments. So a suggestive seal, a brewer who's stewing, a goddess who's brewing, a pair of babbling pots, and an ill-fated tavern. So let's start out with a suggestive seal. This seal right here. If you're not familiar with this, this is what's called a cylinder seal, one of the classic artifact types from ancient Mesopotamia. These are often very small. I think this one is about a centimeter and a half high, often made out of precious stones of different kinds, and they have intricate designs carved into them, often really kind of artistic masterpieces. People would have used these kind of like a signature. If you can think of how you take a stamp seal and put it in wax on the back of a letter, for example, this is something similar. This is but a cylinder seal that they would have taken and rolled in wet clay, and then it leaves behind an impression of the scene that's carved into it. And yeah, so people used it as a kind of signature, and they would often have it either tied around on a cord around their wrist or around their neck. So for a little bit of context about this particular one, so where was this found, right? For that, we're going to zoom out quickly to where is the place that I'm talking about today? Ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here you have a general map to orient us. You can see in the background, I hope you've got modern political boundaries. You can see that we're talking basically about modern day Iraq and parts of northeastern Syria. And what I've highlighted here in the two circles is the two kind of main subregions of Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, which is the kind of classic heartland of cities, the irrigated agriculture zone, and then northern Mesopotamia, which is the dry farming or rain-fed zone. We're going to be looking at material from across both of these. Chronologically, my book covers a broad range of time. I say that I get started a little before 3000 BC, and then it basically covers the next 3 millennia. And that's what you see in pink over on the left side there. And I do quite a lot of sort of picking from different, jumping back and forth to different time periods, which is maybe not ideal, but I don't think that we're at a point yet where we can really tell a complete story that moves through time and tells us about the evolving beer culture. But I think it's a good goal for the future. What I've highlighted there in red is the early Bronze Age, and that is because that's the date of this seal that we're focusing on here. And it was found at this place called Hamukar, an archaeological site in northeastern Syria. This seal was excavated in 2010, which was the last season that my wife and I were working at the site of Hamukar in Syria. And in that season, she was in the second year of supervising excavations for her PhD dissertation. So she had a series of excavations across the site with different supervisors in charge of each. Well, the co-director of the site, Salam al-Kuntar, was actually helping my wife excavate a series of burials in this trench that you see here. And it's actually the one sort of in the background to the left there that I'm showing you a plan of. This little seal was found in that burial that I've highlighted there, L130, and it had been suspended on a necklace around the person's neck who was buried there. And what you're seeing there on the bottom center right is the very first time that we rolled this seal out, because what's funny about these is when you just look at them, it's very hard to actually figure out what scene is carved into them. So what you have to do is you have to roll them out. So we had to go in search of some modeling clay so we could roll this out and see what was actually depicted there. So this is our first attempt at that, but I'll zoom in now, show you a sort of nicer rolling of it. There you see the seal on the right and then the seal impression. If you're having trouble seeing what's going on, I'm going to actually zoom in a little bit further. Okay. Now, have a look at it. Can you see what's going on? I'm not going to describe it in great detail. What you have in the center is a sort of conical vessel sitting on the floor. There is a woman who is bending over and is drinking out of that vessel, almost certainly through a straw that we can't see. And then behind that woman, there is a man. You can probably see what's going on, but this is kind of a stick figure version of a scene that's actually relatively common, not super common, but relatively common in Mesopotamia, where you have a man and a woman having sex while the woman is bending over drinking beer, almost certainly beer from a vessel through a long straw. So I start out just a second. Yeah. Drinking through a straw is kind of the classic way that they liked to depict beer consumption in Mesopotamia. There are lots more examples like the one you see here, where we have what's called banquet scenes, where people are sort of sitting kind of primly on seats, drinking from a shared vessel through these long straws. We have lots and lots of these, hundreds. Here are some other examples. For example, down there at the bottom right, you see two people drinking from straws again. But then what I'm showing in the other two examples is that they also depict people drinking from cups. I think we feel pretty confident that when they're drinking from straws, it's probably beer that they're drinking. The cups, we're not necessarily so certain. Could be wine. We don't really know. When it comes to the straws, though, so these we have some super fancy straws preserved that are made out of metal, but in general, these would have been long reeds, and reed does not preserve well archaeologically, so very rarely do we have any traces of these drinking straws, except that we have this wonderful series of artifacts that are basically little metal, sort of finger-length filters you can see one there, it's kind of cone shaped, and they had perforations through them. So they would have been attached to the end of a reed straw, and then that end would have been submerged into the beer where it served as a kind of filter. So we have a series of these, mostly from the Middle Bronze Age, and especially, not all of them, but especially coming from burials where they are found a single one down in the base of a pot, like the one that I've circled here. And here you see that one on the left, and then three others from the same site, Chagar Bazaar in Syria, all the same date, all found in burials. Just to point out though, the scale is different here for the vessels and the straws. The straws are actually much smaller relative to the vessels than what you see here. One thing that's fun here, though, is on those three of those filters, you can see that there was actually reed preserved on the inside of them. So that we know that they were once attached to the end of one of these reed straws. So I open up the book with this particular seal because I think it's a really interesting way to get us into this question, this issue of sort of like um, what are the similarities, but also the differences in this very ancient beer culture compared to our own. And I think it does a nice job of opening up these kinds of questions. What I'm showing you here, I also, to kind of continue that, for each chapter, I started out with a little quote from a text, and many of those are Sumerian proverbs, and they like to talk about beer in their proverbs. There's some wonderful ones like, not to know beer is not normal. He is fearful like a man unacquainted with beer. Beer is a bull, the mouth is its stairway. Or the pleasure, it is the beer. The discomfort, it is the journey. I just love these. Um, they get us again into this territory where we kind of recognize, we can see they love beer, we can see some similarities, but then also some of the proverbs are pretty perplexing. In any case, let's move on to our second moment, a brewer who's stewing. Here you see what the ancient city of Uruk looks like today. This was the first city in world history. Here you see it as a ruin, but I want you to imagine this as a bustling city. Um, at this period, maybe 20,000 people, something like that. We are going to zoom down in onto a city street where we're following a man named Kushim as he leaves his house in the morning and he starts making his way through the busy streets. And he's making his way towards the high point in the city where there's these big fancy buildings in the distance. And he sort of makes his way through the streets for a while, and then we follow him, and he ends up at this mud brick building, goes in the doorway, and he sort of surveys the scene, and there's a series of workers doing various things, and then he though very quickly runs over into a little side room, opens it up, breaks the seal on the door that he had sealed with a cylinder seal the previous day. He goes in, goes over and grabs two clay tablets to compare them because he had basically been up all night worrying that he had made a mistake in his accounting. He compares the tablets and everything's fine. And then he sort of feeling better, he goes back out and starts chatting with some of the workers. And we learn that this is in fact a brewery, and he is in charge of this brewery. And these are some of the brewery workers. And so I open up with this little scene of a brewery in the world's first city. Um, Partly just, well, because I want to talk also about the world's first writing. And in fact, many of these earliest documents that we have from Mesopotamia are about beer. But I've constructed this kind of semi-fictional, quite a lot of it is fictional narrative, and I do that, and then I start saying, well, actually, there's a lot about this that we don't actually know for certain. We don't really know that we don't know what this brewery actually looked like. Um, we don't know who worked there. We don't actually know exactly what they were doing there to brew the beer. In fact, we don't know that this guy, Kushim, was a brewer. There's a possibility that he was in charge of something more like a storage facility where they kept brewing ingredients. We don't even know that his name was actually Kushim. The signs at this period that we read Kushim, they might not have been a personal name. They might have been like an office of some kind. We don't really know. Um, we don't even really know that he was active in the city of Uruk. Um, uh, just to show you another slide here. This is a zoomed in shot of some excavations in the city of Uruk up at the high point at the center of this village, this city. That's what he was heading towards when he was on his way to work. Um, this is what's called the Ayana precinct. It's in a series of monumental buildings in this area. Some of them temples, others we're not as sure what they are. This is where most of the earliest cuneiform documents, the earliest written documents in world history were found, something like 5,000 in the ruins of these buildings. Not specifically the ones that I'm talking about here, which is why there's some uncertainty about where he was active. But so when I start pulling back the layers on this little story about all that we don't know, so what do we know? What we do know is those tablets that he went to get in his little office. Those are actually preserved, and you can see some of the two here that he was comparing. Um, these come from about 3000 BC. Not the earliest tablets that we have, but very early in the history of the cuneiform writing system. We have quite a lot of documents about beer. These particular ones, very interesting. We're going to look at the one on the left in particular. What this is documentation of a series of deliveries of beer to particular individuals. What you see is basically numerical signs in each of these little cases. And then if you kind of turn your head clockwise 90 degrees, I think clockwise, and look at these signs, you can see that they're actually depicting different kinds of jars. Some of them have a pointy base, some have a rounded base with other little markings. Those are showing us, those are the signs for different kinds of beer. So what's being tallied up on this side of this tablet is X number of jars of this type of beer, Y number of jars of this other type of beer, Z number of jars of this other type of beer were delivered to X person. And then it starts over again. So it's tabulating a series of deliveries of beer. If we flip this tablet over onto the back side, the reverse, um, I've given you a drawing of it here and kind of color coded it to see if it can help you understand it. What we have is so you've got deliveries of beer on the one side. On the back, what he's doing, whoever was writing this tablet, was tallying up all of the ingredients that were used to brew all those jars of beer on the other side. So it proceeds by basically, if you look in the center in red, it gets a total jar count for the four different beer types that were mentioned on the other side. And then for each of those total jar counts, it breaks it down into two kinds of ingredients that were used, groats and malt, um, barley groats and malted barley to brew those. And then over on the left side in blue, it gives us a total of all of the malted barley and all of the barley groats that were used to brew all of those jars of beer on the other side, right? So this early document about beer, it's not only showing us, it's showing us both the delivery of beer, but also all the ingredients that were used to brew that beer, or at least some key grain ingredients. And then in orange down at the bottom, you see the signature, Kushim, possibly this guy that we were talking about as a brewer. Okay. So I made up his brewery, right? That was in my imagination, but we do have better evidence from some later periods. Um, Not any that where we are absolutely certain that what we're looking at is a brewery, but I'm showing you the best case here from the site of Tel al-Hiba. That's the ancient city of Lagash in Iraq. This is a building that was excavated in a sort of temple precinct called the Bagara, dedicated to the god Ningirsu. Uh, and and what in the book, I give us another little imaginative scenario where I take us back in time and we go through a tour through this building that was excavated. We start out, if you can see my little walking tour, um, the building on the left is probably a major shrine to the god Ningirsu, and we kind of peek in there, but then we quickly head down into a little alleyway between that building and another one that was built right next to it. And that's the building that might very well have been a brewery. And we pay more attention. We go into each room of this brewery to check out exactly what was preserved in it. And I've shown you a few photos there. It's not absolutely certain that it was a brewery, but the kind of things that were found in it make good sense for a brewery. There was even a cuneiform tablet that mentions that mentions a brewery and also a specific named brewer and the distribution of some beer. So this is our best case for an archaeologically excavated brewery in Mesopotamia. Okay, now our third moment, a goddess who's brewing. So we saw those very early cuneiform tablets that talk about beer and brewing ingredients. For the next 3,000 years, beer is all over the place in the cuneiform record. We have thousands, it appears in thousands of tablets, but what I'm showing you here is the most famous one, or the most famous text, the hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of beer. This hymn to the beer goddess always appears in association with another text that we have that has been called a drinking song. We don't know exactly if that's what it was, but they appear together on three known tablets, in some cases with some other songs. And I'm giving you the names of these. In Mesopotamia, they liked to, the title of a text was typically the first line. And so I'm giving you what those names would have been if that was the case with these. So this hymn to Ninkasi, this is definitely the most famous document about brewing in Mesopotamia and has played a major role in discussions of how they brewed beer. But if you've ever heard that this was a recipe for brewing beer, I just want to tell you it is not a recipe for brewing beer. This is a hymn or a song of some kind that is praising the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and it's praising her by painting a series of little pictures of her at work in the brewery doing the key activities of the brewer. So you get a little flavor of what it's telling us here. Like Ninkasi, you're the one who handles dough, mixing in a pit the bapier with sweet aromatics. You're the one who bakes the bapier, puts in order the piles of hulled grain. You're the one who waters the earth-covered malt, soaks the malt in a jar, spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. The one who holds with both hands the great sweet wort, brewing it with honey and wine. You're the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It's like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. Right? It's nice, but it is not a recipe. Trying to use that to brew beer is a very challenging task. And so I spend a good bit of time in the book trying to talk about what kind of text, how sort of temper our expectations about what we ought to be able to get from this text. So I do that partly by comparing it to a series of more recent drinking songs, in particular drinking songs that also have something to tell us about the brewing of beer, like this one at the top, beer, beer, beer. Lord bless Charlie Mops, the man who invented beer, 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 a barrel of malt, a bushel of hops. You stir it around with a stick, the kind of lubrication to make your engine tick. Or John Barleycorn, which is a song that takes us, it's sort of, we have a personified barleycorn, and it takes us him from the field as he's processed and turned into beer or maybe whiskey in this case. Um, I try to do this just to sort of think like, what if the hymn to Ninkasi was something more like a drinking song? It was certainly a song, um, just to get us to sort of, again, temper our expectations about what we ought to expect to get from it. Because in either of these examples I'm showing you here, again, using that to actually brew beer would be very difficult. A number of other issues that I spent some time on. Um, there are major translational difficulties in the hymn to Ninkasi. We have two main translations by Miguel Seville and much more recently by Walter Salaberger. Um, and there's substantial differences in how these two Sumerologists understood the brewing process behind the translations. Certainly, Salaberger's had 50 some years of further research to draw on behind it. So there are all kinds of improvements in the way he's understanding it. But also, he has a very specific understanding of how brewing worked in Mesopotamia that's coming through in this translation. And so the reason I've highlighted these in colors is just to allow you to sort of compare the same how these two Sumerologists translated the same lines. I'm not going to read through them right now. Need to keep moving. Again, I spend a lot of time on this text because it's been very important in discussions of beer in Mesopotamia. One thing that I talk about is I talk about what I call two traps that have sort of seductive traps that I think have hindered our interpretation of it. One I call the minimalist trap, the other the terminological trap, which is what I'm illustrating here. And that is basically the idea that when translating this text, it's been Miguel Seville, for example, is the example I'm using here. He took a lot of the ancient terms and translated them using terms from our own sort of European derived brewing tradition. And I think it introduces a lot of assumptions that are probably unwarranted. And there's the danger of kind of taking what might have been a very different brewing process from the past and sort of erasing the possibility of seeing how it might have been very different from our own. So I spend a good bit of time on this terminological trap and then also the minimalist trap. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. I'm probably not going as fast as I need to. Um, so in the two main languages of Mesopotamia, Sumerian and Akkadian, the basic words for beer were kash and shikaru. But we also know about a lot of different kinds of beer. This is showing you different types of beer as we move through time from the Uruk period at the top left, where we can't really translate them very well, through the early dynastic, where we have golden, dark, sweet dark, red, and strained beer, to in the Akkadian period, differences that seem to be based probably on the malt content of the beer. So probably a rate higher and higher in alcohol content. Maybe something similar in the Ur 3 period where we had ordinary, good, and very good beer. Maybe ordinary, strong, good, and very, sorry, ordinary, strong, and very strong beer. And then you see some other examples from the Old Babylonian period. Um, it's it's relatively rare that we have the kind of evidence that I showed you from the Uruk period, where we know exactly the ingredients that went into those particular types of beer. Um, but in the early dynastic period, for those, the golden, dark, etc., we do have some of those. This comes from the city of Girsu. I'm showing you one example where we see a certain quantity of golden beer, 45 liters in our system. And then we see the exact proportion of three different ingredients used to brew it. Emmer wheat, which is an ancient kind of wheat that you can still get today. Malted barley, which is the main ingredient in many of our own beers today. And then an enigmatic ingredient called bapir. Malted barley, again, this is a real point of connection between our beers and their beers. This is the base of basically all of their beers and many of our beers today. But we actually know relatively little about exactly how they were going about malting barley. What I'm showing you here is a series of phrases in Sumerian and Akkadian that give us little hints about the malting process, which is basically malting is basically where you're wetting a grain and allowing it to start germinating and then halting the germination. So that's what you're seeing little examples of here, like the horn growing out for the germinated malt. I can't dig down into this now, but so malted barley, that is the point where everyone is pretty much in agreement about what this ingredient was. Bapir is totally different. There have been a lot of different interpretations of what this key ingredient might have been. Here I'm just showing you some of the different kinds of texts that we have to tell us about Bapir. And to illustrate kind of the challenge of triangulating on all these different uses of the term to try to figure out what it actually was, we have lexical lists or word lists, like at the top left, where you get little hints about things that might have been done to the bapir. You get recipes, kind of things down in the bottom left. At the top right, this is a recipe. No, sorry, this is a letter where you have uh, this is, I believe, a wife writing to her husband, who is a trader far away, and she's saying, "The bapir I made for you has become too old. I need to make some more. I need ingredients." And then on the bottom right, you have a recipe for making particular kind of meat stew. And so bapir, this brewing ingredient, is also being used to make a stew. What you're seeing here is some efforts to not only interpret what this BAP year might have been, but actually use it to brew beer. One at Anchor Brewing collaborated with the University of Chicago uh, back in the late 80s to brew a Mesopotamian beer. They interpreted BAP beer as something like biscotti, a twice-baked bread that they were using early in the brewing process, putting it into what's called the mash, where you're basically taking malted barley, heating it up in water to extract sugars and enzymes and things. So they used it as a source of sugar and flavor, that kind of thing. Here you're seeing me over the past couple of months. I've been working with Trophy Brewing here in Raleigh, where I live, to make a Mesopotamian beer for an event that's coming out later this week. And here you see me playing with our version of Bapir. We've gone with a totally different interpretation, was that it was something like a sourdough starter that had been dried out and that was then being used as the fermentation starter for this beer. So I was trying all different ways of drying it out to try not to kill off the yeast and to have it function well. I can't spend a lot of time on this, but I actually got into this topic in the first place through this kind of experimental work when I was a grad student at the University of Chicago. Uh, we had a sort of long-running collaborative project with Great Lakes Brewing Company in Cleveland to try to recreate Mesopotamian beers as accurately as we could. You can see here some of our ceramic vessels that we were using. And here you see just some shots of the making of those vessels and some of the different processes that we were aiming for. We were basically trying to go with as authentic equipment as possible, as authentic process as possible, and also ingredients. There were lots of uncertainties, but that's what we were aiming for. We held a series of tasting events in different cities where we would let people try our always at least two beers. One was the one brewed on the replica equipment. That's the Inky brew that you see here. And then we would let them try another one that was the same ingredients, but brewed in our modern equipment. And that's the Gilgamesh that you see next to it. We also would let people try it through straws, which was a lot of fun. Okay, my fourth moment. I'm going to have to move quickly through it. A pair of babbling pots. Here I take us to the site of Tel Bazi in Syria, an archaeological site. What you're seeing here is a plan of a building that looks kind of like houses at the site, but it actually is possible that it was a tavern, a house that had been converted partly into a tavern. And at the entrance to the tavern was this big vessel that they have interpreted as a beer vessel. This is because the excavators there did a bunch of residue analysis on a series of vessels and found evidence for the brewing of beer in a whole series of them. So they feel pretty confident that they know the set of vessels that was used to brew beer at this site. And they've used that to argue that basically every house was brewing its own beer, but then you also have some potential taverns. So you're seeing two key vessels on the right. One, a sort of collecting vessel, and then sitting above it, a vessel that has a hole in its base, if you can see that. Um, we have lots of evidence for vessels. When you excavate in this region, you find huge numbers of ceramic vessels. A real challenge, though, is connecting that up to another very rich source, which is types of vessels mentioned in cuneiform tablets. There are lots and lots of words for vessels of all different kinds, and I'm showing you some of them here in Sumerian and Akkadian. But I want to highlight one particular class of vessels. There's a bunch of different terms for vessels that had a hole in the base. Some even are named after that. So the Nigdur Bur is basically, it means a vessel whose bottom is a hole. Um, this is one of our best points of connection with the archaeological record, where we can say, look, we have a whole series of vessels that have holes in the base that we think are probably the same as what's being mentioned in the cuneiform record. And these are really like the classic brewing vessels in Mesopotamia. When they talk about brewing, they often are talking about these. And they often talk about them as part of a pair, which is what you're seeing here. Something like the Nigdur Bur, which makes a pleasant sound, is Ninkasi has placed appropriately on top of a large lachtan. So what you generally have is a vessel with a hole in its base sitting over a collecting vessel. They love to talk about the wonderful sound that these vessels made. They even give us a great example of onomatopoeia at the bottom here, where they say the shagub and the lamsari make a double-double sound. If you're having trouble imagining that sound, say it over and over a few times. Double double, double double, double double, like some liquid dripping from one vessel down into the other. Um, we don't really know what these vessels were doing in the brewing process, but almost certainly this was a sound to them that means either the brewing of beer or the finished beer moving down into the vessel. Um, not leaving enough time. I'll go very quickly through this part. The other thing from Tel Bazi that I wanted to mention is that they also brewed some beer back in the day, and they basically used it to make an argument that the beer may have been very low in alcohol content in Mesopotamia, and that kind of got picked up by a lot of other people. And so there is a sense of that out there, and like from this quote you see on the screen here. And it is definitely possible that some of their beer was very low in alcohol. But I always question this because I think there's plenty of evidence, especially if we look at the written record, that they considered beer something that impacts people. It does something to us when we drink it. Like from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu drinks 7 goblets of beer. His mood became free. He started to sing. His heart grew merry. His face lit up. Or we have texts like this letter at the top that's telling us about a trader who was being chided because he had sold some cloth to another trader while he was drunk and presumably didn't get a good deal on it. Or this great piece of advice in the instructions of Sharupak: you should not pass judgment when you drink beer. We even have medical texts that might be giving us a sense for some of the negative effects of beer consumption, making people unsteady on their foundations, diminishing their eyesight, making your head hurt. He continually forgets his word and slurs them when speaking, not in full possession of his faculties, etc. We have those individual effects. We also have collective effects. It's kind of a trope in Mesopotamian literature. Very often you'll have two persons, in this case, sheep and grain, who sat down together. They started drinking beer and wine, and then it launches them into an argument or a debate. We have other texts like this one about the gods Inanna and Enki, where we have Inanna basically getting all dressed up, all fancy, to go possibly intentionally to the god Enki and essentially not steal, but take a series of powers from him that he's in control of. They sit down, they drink beer together, he gets drunk, and then we see him waking up and he says, "Where have all my powers gone?" to his minister who's standing there. And his minister says, "You just gave them all away while you were drunk." So we have these examples of alcohol impacting people. So it's possible that some of their beer was very low in alcohol, but I'm skeptical that all of it would have been. All right, one final moment, which will be brief: an ill-fated tavern. Um, This is another one more little fictional scene that I depict where we are in a street um, in thousands of years later, after the city of Uruk, in the city of Babylon. There's several other possibilities, but I'm putting us in Babylon. We're walking down the street. We see two guys bent down on the side of the road doing something weird. One of them scoops up some dirt and puts it in a little pouch on his belt, and they get up and they talk a little and they head off down the road. We peek in behind them and we're like, well, this is like carpenter's workshop. What's going on here? This is weird. Let's follow them. So we follow them through the city streets and they keep stopping off at different doors or at intersections and gathering up dirt. They stop off at a maltster's house. They stop off by the gate to the palace. They're moving all through the streets. Eventually they end up down by the river where they scoop up some river water. And then this guy dumps all of the dirt down in there. He takes another little flask out and dribbles some oil in, stirs it all up, and then they head off again and we follow them. And they end up in front of a building where he takes some goop out of that and he puts it across the top of the doorway. And then they go in and they head up some stairs in the back. So we follow them in and we discover, oh, this is a tavern. Nice. So we sit down and have some beers. But while they're up on the roof and we hear all this kind of chanting going on. And so I give us this scene, which I think is fascinating. And I'm going to show you some of the evidence behind it here. Um, this was a special kind of ritual procedure. It might seem at first like, oh, so it ends. So it starts out, but part of it at least is all about gathering this dust, just like I had told you. But it ends up with this guy, one of the guys calling out, Ishtar, stand by me to further my affairs. May this tavern trade be your tavern trade. Ishtar, lay your hand on the pot stand and mixing that. May profit come my way and never cease. This text seems like it might be about guaranteeing profit for a tavern, but it's actually more interesting than that. What it probably is an example of what's called a Namburbi ritual. Um, these were basically rituals designed to counteract a negative omen. The Mesopotamian world was basically full of signs of all different kinds that could be read in the stars or in the flight of a flock of birds or the way a dog barked or in the entrails of sheep. And so you had all these omens. It was a major form of knowledge production in Mesopotamia. They were high-level specialists involved, like working for the king doing this. But this meant one important thing was, well, what happens if you're one of those people, say, working for the king and you get a negative omen? What do you do? And there emerged a series of rituals for counteracting the effects of negative omens. So what we have here seems to be a way of counteracting a negative omen for this particular tavern. It's even on a tablet that one of the tablets that it's preserved on looks like it could have been hung from the ceiling of the tavern, basically to be there physically providing protection. So I just think this is a fun little moment. And I'm going to finish with one slide here. So in the book, I finish up with this. I suggest that we take a line from that drinking song that always appears with the hymn to Ninkasi, and maybe that we bring it back in as a toast ourselves. So Ninkasi Zada Humu Udanti. May Ninkasi live together with you. All right, thanks. Sorry that I went a little long.
All right. Thank you so much, Tate. That was wonderful. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to do my best to get as many of them to you before our time is up.
Yeah, I'm sorry
So,
about that.
no, 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 no. So, one of the questions that actually has come up a few times in a few forms, so I'm going to kind of blend a few together here, is this question about whether or not beer was there because and so popular because the water was unsafe, or some variation therein.
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. It's on my list of things that I actually want to figure out a way to address because I think it's often an assumption, and it's not an unreasonable one. I mean, you have for the first time in world history, huge numbers of people living together tightly in these densely packed settlements and lots of animals, etc. So, yes, maybe. I don't currently know of good evidence for that, like good evidence that the water was not safe to drink. And it's a challenging issue to try to figure out what that evidence would look like. I know I once saw one medical text that mentioned a diagnosis for someone. Well, the diagnosis was you're feeling the way you do because you drank contaminated water, but it's not something that I at least that I know of in large quantities. So it's a great question, and I would love to hear ideas if someone knows can think of a good way to address this in text archaeologically, but I think it's only an assumption at this point.
We have another question I want to raise. This one's from Charles Kumpus, and apologies if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Was beer drinking by both sexes, only for men, in special places? Yeah, so the gender of
Yes. It's a great question. I don't know why I didn't include some angle on that in the talk. Yes, the question of gender is a fascinating one. I mean, um, and in special places. Okay, so the simple answer is both men and women were drinking beer, in all different kinds of contexts. I think almost certainly there would have been, gendered practices surrounding beer drinking, but I don't think we currently have a good understanding of those. This was a patriarchal society where there were major marked differences between genders, and so I think we should expect it. But there's plenty of cases where men and women are drinking together in different contexts, like in the artistic record, those banquet scenes that I showed you. Sometimes they show only men, sometimes they show only women, often they show both. We have plenty of literary texts that depict men and women drinking together. It's, I think it's a, yes, so I think it's a good question. I don't think we yet really know the answer. You're saying in special places. People drink beer in all kinds of different places. I think at home, the evidence for that is scanter, but at home in taverns, sometimes at least at work, in temples, in feasts of all different kinds, from very small, intimate ones up to very, huge community level ones. All different sorts of contexts where beer was being consumed. Yeah.
So this one is from Ethan Dubroff. Is there any evidence for inner city trade of beer, so trade of beer between the cities?
It's a good question. Once again, my answer is going to be I don't know of good evidence for that. I think so. Definitely, the assumption has generally been that beer would have been basically consumed while it was still fermenting and that it was not really a trade item. Um, but there are certainly periods where you have particular vessels that are beer vessels that I feel like were being used to at least move beer across some kind of distance. The answer is I don't know. I don't know yet, but it's another of those that's on my list of things to try to actually address. Because again, I think it's kind of like our assumption has been that wine was traded over distance in Mesopotamia, but probably not beer. But I think that's not something that's really been carefully explored.
Great. We have another one from Melissa Heller Booth. She's asking about the inferior beer versus the very fine beer, and if we know kind of what made the distinctions between them.
Um, Well, the answer is not really. I mean, the I sort of mentioned it when I was talking about those beer types. The the strongest sense we have is that the fancier beers generally seem to have had a higher proportion of malt in them. So more fermentable sugars, meaning at least up to a point, a higher alcohol beer. So I suspect that that's probably one of the main differences. But there's so much that we're not seeing. I think because when we just get these sort of base, we get these terms that they're using to describe them, but they're not giving us an actual description of the beers. This is just their sort of names. And so I think it could be other things like degree of filtering. There's certainly they have filtered beers and others presumably then that were not filtered. And another thing that we have a really poor understanding of is what kind of additional kind of aromatics or other flavorings they might have been using, if any. There's one kind of plant that called kasu that is eventually used, but there's lots of debate over what it actually was. Um, and so that's a point where you could certainly have substantial differences that the king, the beer for the king had all kinds of expensive things that have been come in from afar or something, but we don't have good evidence for that.
So here's a question from Carol Neumann de Vegvar. Was beer used in performing libations and sort of in religious rituals?
Yes, great question. Interestingly, uh, I felt once I finished the book, I kind of realized that I didn't actually spend as much time on the religious dimensions of beer, whether consumption or libations in the book. And I was invited to give a keynote lecture at a conference this summer that was all about divine drinks. And so it gave me a chance to actually start doing that. And yeah, the answer is beer was one of their major kinds of libations. And so we have all sorts of artistic scenes showing us libations. That is probably often beer. I mean, they were also libating water and other things, but and plenty of written evidence for the libation of beer and all kinds of different rituals, whether you're talking about rituals against field pests out that where you conducted them out in an agricultural field and libations were a part of that, or in the fanciest um, temple contexts, that sort of thing. Yeah.
We have one from Matthew T. Any cuneiform references to the day after or hangover cures?
Other than not really. I think that that text that I showed you about Inanna and Enki, that's one case where we see it's not quite about what you're asking, but where we see him kind of like coming out of a sort of fog after drinking, but not that I know of. It is an important point. So even though I am, I do push back against the idea that all their beer was really low in alcohol content. They also don't talk about being super drunk all the time. Beer is something that does things to people, but you don't get lots of depictions of people who are just falling over drunk. And as far as I know, I don't want to misstate this. There might be some proverbs that obliquely reference hangovers. I can't quite remember. So there might be a little bit of evidence, but it's not extensive.
So we have had a number of different questions in the Q&A about your preferences in the beer versus the traditional versus the sort of modern equipment brewed, and sort of what the differences between those were, sort of, and how they were. So
Oh yeah, absolutely. So with that project with Great Lakes Brewing, the one that we brewed on the more authentic equipment, I said it was basically the same ingredients as the other, but it wasn't quite. The one other difference is that we used our version of Bapir to brew that, also with the same kind of interpretation as this more recent brewing I've done, that it might have been a kind of fermentation starter, and that gave the beer a very different taste. So it meant that we were fermenting it not with just a pure yeast culture, but also bacteria and things. And so all of our um, all of our experimental beers had a tart element to them, from sort of mildly tart to pretty sour. And they differed because we did this over several years. In color, they were sometimes kind of milky white to sort of yellowish. Um, we were using, I said we don't really know what ingredients they might have added for flavoring, but we tried different things like juniper and coriander and cardamom. I basically let the brewers choose, and they mostly chose things that they were at least somewhat familiar with. But that added an interesting element to it. The one that we brewed on the modern equipment was maybe something like a saison, something like that. Because it was also interestingly herbal, and it just didn't have that. It didn't have that kind of that sour element to it. When we would ask people which one they preferred, usually we get about half would say they preferred the authentic one, but it's like a sort of um, biased, a biased sample or some audience because they were coming to try that beer.
well, I have another one that has been asked in quite a few times in quite a few different ways, which is, do we think that we're talking about the origins of beer here? Can you speak to the origins of beer? There's a lot of curiosity about, where first.
Yes, great question. I did skate over that very quickly, and I do talk about it some in the book. But as I mentioned here, my focus is really it's this period where we start getting really rich evidence. So there's some evidence thousands of years earlier from the sort of not exactly Mesopotamia, but the surrounding region for some very early beer in the sort of maybe 10,000 BC range. Um, it's debated, but I think it's very likely that when we're talking about the origins of beer in this region, it's at least back then. And so it's fascinating that we get these little hints about those very early origins, but then there's several thousands of years where we don't actually know what was going on with beer. And so when I pick up the story here, we're talking about a complex brewing tradition that's probably, been developing for thousands of years. So if anybody ever says like, "Oh, this beer was just nasty," and they just brewed it using the basic steps, I would say, "No, no, no. This had like thousands of years behind it, probably." And so we should expect sophistication, et cetera. And so I think that's like wide open territory for learning more about that in-between period. And I should also say, I always want to emphasize that I think people sometimes like to think, is this where beer was invented first? And then it sort of spread out. And I really try to emphasize that beer made from different sorts of grains was definitely discovered independently in different parts of the world at different times. There could be elements of a spread, maybe as part of like the spread of the Neolithic out of the Near East. But I like to always emphasize that this is not a story of like a single origin point and then beer spreading out from there.
All right, excellent. So we have come to time. So I want to take a moment again to thank you, Tate, for your talk and answering all these questions, but also thank all the AIA staff for helping put this together, as well as our wonderful translators who have been working so hard throughout this discussion. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you.